Now, forgive me for being slightly facetious here, but I thought when I saw Dominic Cummings walking out of Downing Street with his big box on Friday night, then emerging later with a bottle of champagne in a see-through bag, that this was all some kind of bizarre, kind of, complicated pantomime, all set up by Dominic Cummings to make it look as though he was leaving, but in fact he might turn up for work again on Monday morning. Then we hear the stories over the weekend of Carrie Symonds having parties, having great sort of laughing sessions with Allegra Stratton, who apparently voted for Brexit and the Tory party for the last two elections, according to her. We then discover that there's all sorts of things going on in government which are against the rules that we're all having to live by. Now, as a result of that, Boris Johnson is self-isolating because he ran into Lee Anderson, an MP, who later tested positive for COVID-19. It really is quite remarkable. You really couldn't make this stuff up. Let's talk to Nigel Farage, leader of the Brexit Party. Nigel, a very good morning to you on what is a very bizarre week in politics, isn't it?
Oh, completely. The one observation I've got, Mike, is that the leavers are leaving Downing Street. Dominic Cummings is a very odd chap, but he was bright enough to understand that leaving the European Union was about getting back control of our lives. He was bright enough to understand that millions of people had deserted the Labour Party, had voted UKIP, had voted Brexit, and that if he got the pitch right on Brexit, on immigration in the north of England, they would vote Conservative, or at least lend their votes to the Conservative Party. And personal feelings aside, he absolutely wanted to get a proper Brexit delivered because he knew that's the way they kept those voters for the next election. And to see him and Lee Kane walking out, and you ask yourself, who's in charge? Well, Queen Carrie clearly is very influential. And Allegra Stratton, who on a personal level is delightful, but used to work for the BBC, used to write for The Guardian. And then you've got the Goves and people like that on the edges, advocating a much softer line on Brexit. And then you've got the fact that, and who knows what will happen with the recounts in Georgia and with the, cases, the pending court cases on Dominion, this computer counting system in America. But it does look likely, doesn't it, that we're going to get a pro-Brussels, pro-Dublin president in the USA. And I just had this terrible sinking feeling over the weekend that Boris is very close to selling out on Brexit.
Well, the one thing I think we have learned, Nigel, over the course of this pandemic, if we didn't think it before, is that Boris Johnson will basically do whatever the last person he saw tells him to do. And he seems to have literally no principle of any kind and very little backbone.
Well, he can't make decisions. Twice over the years, I've been involved with Boris about doing events. And he's, yes. Oh, I'm not sure. Let me consult my people. I remember once saying to him, what? So you're telling me you're going to ask the apparatchiks whether you can do this? You can't make your own mind up. And he pretty much agreed.
Yeah.
And so without that influence of Cummings and people like that, on this crucial phase in Brexit, it is Carrie Symonds and Allegra Stratton and Michael Gove who he's going to be listening to. And that's why I feel so pessimistic.
Well, indeed. I was going to ask you about your dealings with Boris, because obviously in the lead up to the election, there were things that the Brexit Party did for the Tories, which enabled them to get quite a bit as big a majority as they actually got. Did you find yourself dealing with him on that or dealing with others?
No, I dealt with him previously, but I dealt with him during the referendum campaign itself. And we spoke on a regular basis and, agreed things like lines to take. And there was a good degree of cooperation with him, as I say, until it came to making real decisions. And he couldn't do those. He had to refer to Dominic Cummings in every single case. I didn't deal with him directly in the election last time round, but I did deal with his right-hand men. And look, I did not want, particularly in the south and the southwest of England, the Brexit Party vote to give the Lib Dems a big surge, because it would have happened. And if we'd finished up in a situation of a second referendum, that would have been dreadful for the country. So I did give Boris the benefit of the doubt, although I didn't like the withdrawal agreement or the new European treaty. He did make some pledges running up to the election that said he'd be tougher than that. I gave him the benefit of the doubt, and I'm just beginning to wonder why.
Yes, well, that's very true. We'll come back to some of his new policies as well in a moment on the green front. But what do you make of this rather bizarre situation which he now finds himself in, where he announces that, first of all, he has a meeting with Lee Anderson, one of the new Tory MPs from the North, who he didn't have to have a face-to-face meeting with anyway. He's pictured with him standing without a mask on, right? He now says that he got some form of a ping from his NHS app because he now finds out that Lee Anderson's positive for COVID, and he's now going to lock himself away for 14 days, despite the fact that he's already had the disease.
So tens of millions of people all over the world have suffered from COVID-19. Of those tens of millions, there are literally a handful of people that have been reinfected. So it is a fraction of a small percentage point chance that in a short meeting, he's contracted this virus again. However, it's all very easy to work out. The swab test, the up-the-nose swab test, will, with certainty, 2 or 3 days after you've been in contact with somebody who's COVID-19, tell you whether you've got the virus or not, tell you whether you're carrying the virus or not. The idea that because he had a quick meeting last Thursday, that the Prime Minister of our country, during the greatest economic crisis in peacetime we've ever lived through, as the Brexit talks head towards this absolutely critical couple of weeks, the idea that he's going to self-isolate to the 26th of November, just because he wants to show the country that we must all obey the rules incidentally, which change every couple of weeks anyway, is, I think, a complete abdication of responsibility. Matt Hancock keeps telling us about how marvellous the testing regime has become. So the answer this morning, the message that should go to Boris Johnson from this show this morning is very simple. Get a swab test this morning. When it confirms that you are negative, as it's almost certain to do, get back to work, meet Michel Barnier, and get Brexit done. To cower in Downing Street until the 26th of November is an abdication of your responsibilities as Prime Minister. There is no earthly medical reason why you should do so.
And I would absolutely endorse that message because, as you say, Nigel, surely the whole point of the testing regime is to get people back to normal life as best as possible so that they can prove that they don't have the disease. Because if that's not the reason for it, what is the reason for taking a test to make yourself hide away?
It's crazy. I mean, look at my situation, Mike. I'm now day 10 back from the United States of America, right? I'm day 10 in quarantine. And yet, I'll tell you something. I did leave home last week. I drove to London. Do you know why? I went to get a coronavirus
to get a test.
I had the test. It was negative. The clinicians said, it's now been 5 days since you've been back from America. There is absolutely no chance that you will develop COVID-19. There is no chance that you've got it. I said, well, in these circumstances, does it mean I still have to stay in quarantine? She said, yes, the rules make no exception. Now, look, it doesn't matter for me so much. You know, I can work from home. The pubs are closed, so there's nowhere to go anyway, really. Right. But the Prime Minister, for goodness sake. I mean, one of the reasons that he claimed that he got the deal last October was that he met Varadkar, the Irish Taoiseach, face to face. Do you remember it was that meeting?
Yes.
That suddenly seemed to change things. He needs to, and either Barnier needs to come to Downing Street or he needs to go to Brussels in the next few days to have this out face to face, to make it clear he's not going to back down on the promises that he made the British people. But apparently he's not prepared to do that. And I think it sends out a dreadful message. I think it is a total lack of leadership. Frankly, I think it's bordering on cowardice.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people would agree with that. And looking at what the noises are coming out of the EU right now, I mean, to be fair to them, which I don't particularly like being, it turns out that they say, look, it doesn't matter who's doing the negotiation. It doesn't matter really who the advisors are. We're not really that interested in whether Cummings is there or not. But in the end, it's down to the Prime Minister. So even they're saying it's down to the Prime Minister. So whatever David Frost may say, and however pessimistic he may appear to be on Twitter, it's Boris Johnson's job to get this done.
Yeah, it is. And you know something, I mean, you know, Zoom calls are fine. And, you know, here's you and I chatting on Skype, Mike, and it's fine. But I tell you something, we would have a better interview if I was sitting next to you in the studio. You know that, I know that, and the viewers and listeners know that. That's the way the world works. You know, he needs to sit down with Barnier, and whether it's over a cup of coffee or a glass of red, I don't really care. But there is something about human beings meeting, looking each other in the eye. That is how, in the world, deals get done.
Well, I mean, my problem at the moment as well with Boris Johnson is I'm not quite sure how this self-isolating in Downing Street thing works. I mean, is Carrie self-isolating with him? Will she have to self-isolate as a result of him pinging? Because presumably she might have been quite near the meeting. I don't know.
After last week, let's hope so.
Well, absolutely right. I mean, you know, maybe that's one of the reasons for his self-isolation. But let's talk as well about this green business of the Downing
Street. I hope they keep as far apart as possible for the next couple of weeks.
Well, quite. I mean, let's talk a little bit about this green thing as well, because, you know, I made a point on Friday that in the midst of all of this turmoil, with Dominic Cummings leaving, Lee Kane leaving, the one tweet that Boris puts out is about saving some far away part of the Pacific Ocean for some turtles and a few whales. And I'm thinking, is this really the most important thing you can think of tweeting at the moment?
Well, look, why has he got an 80-seat majority? He's got it because he gave a robust message on Brexit, a robust message on immigration. I know we're not supposed to discuss that subject. It's all too awkward and very difficult, but actually it matters hugely to people out there in the country. And he said he'd fight for the little guy. Yeah? He said there'd be a levelling up that would go on in this country. All we have seen is a Conservative government, a chumocracy with their mates who work in big business, in lobbying companies, in parts of the media, dishing out contracts so far this year for £1.5 billion, contracts given out to their friends without any due process whatsoever. So they've maintained corporatism and not helping the little guy. And the idea that they're now going to go and do what David Cameron did, to try and make the leader writers at The Guardian like them by talking about trans rights, by being as woke as possible, perhaps taking the knee to BLM and other Marxist organisations. And now to say we're going to have a taxpayer-funded Green New Deal, which basically in the north of England will close down every chemical plant, every refinery, take lots and lots of jobs away from heavy engineering and from business. This, Mr. Johnson, is not what people voted for. And if you think doing what David Cameron did, going down a line that is popular with the Notting Hill dinner party set, is going to help you in the country, you've got completely the wrong thought process here. People want genuine, strong leadership. They want people to stand up for the country, stand up for Brexit, control our borders, and actually help the little guy, help the 6 million people out there, men and women running their own businesses, acting as sole traders. Many of them have been thrown under the bus during the course of this pandemic. And that is the way that a Conservative government keeps the blue-collar vote, keeps the working-class vote in the north of England, and he's running a mile from it. It is, I think, looking at what's happened over the last few days, in my mind, it's the beginning of the end of Boris's premiership unless he changes tack very, very quickly.
Well, look at all the big noises they're making about things like doing away with petrol and diesel cars in 2030. You know, that's only 10 years away. There will be people, it'll come as a great surprise, as you say, to the Notting Hill set, that people, working people, ordinary people, actually might buy a van to do their business in, which they might actually keep for 10 to 12 years. They might not be renewing it every 3 years, like rich people in London do. They might actually have a car for a long time.
Well, actually, the rich people in London don't have cars anymore. They bicycle everywhere.
Oh, yes.
And which I've got
on £4,000 bikes, right?
But it is a classic London urban view of the world. Actually, out there in the real world, people need cars to get their kids to school in many cases. Need cars, as you say, or vans to do their jobs. And when we get the government telling us, you know, that we're going to phase out motor cars, they'll all be electric by 2030, it's all going to be great, I cast my mind back just a few years to being told we should all buy diesel cars because that was better for the environment. And then, lo and behold, a few years later, they say we got it all wrong. Look, no one is arguing that across the world, you know, dealing with problems like pollution are very real issues, and it's a huge problem. with a Chinese population of 1.4 billion, an Indian population of over a billion, countries that are mining coal and burning coal at levels we can't even begin to understand, whilst it matters, we are producing less than 2% of carbon dioxide in the world. And I'd like to see a slight change of emphasis. Rather than taxing, punishing, going for grand new schemes, why don't we start planting trees? Why don't we lead a global initiative to plant hundreds of billions, and I mean this, hundreds of billions of trees across the world to capture some CO2? Why not come up with some positives rather than these constant negatives? And they are negatives, because if he goes on down this green route, I can see things like the fuel escalator being put back on petrol and diesel, and it's ordinary folk that pay the price, and it's companies, mostly foreign companies, subsidised to the hilt by taxpayer money that benefits.
Exactly right. And 2 weeks now to go after this Wednesday for this lockdown. If Boris Johnson hides out in Downing Street for most of that period, he's going to emerge presumably on the 2nd of December. We're told he wants everybody to have as normal a Christmas as possible. But what happens in January?
Well, if the logic is to protect the National Health Service and they're scared of a huge wave, they'll lock us down again in January. One figure to ponder. If you look at intensive care units in London, all right, the numbers of people in those ICU beds are now 80% lower than they were at the end of May. I'm not underplaying the fact that this virus can be horrible and some people react very badly to it. And I've got 2 cases, Mike, 2 cases in my own family of people that have had COVID and are suffering from the longer form of it. So I'm not laughing this off. I'm not pretending that it doesn't matter. But what I am saying is we have to get a sense of perspective. And when we're 80% lower in terms of ICU admissions, and yet we've cancelled routine operations, we're not screening people with type 1 diabetes, lung cancer diagnoses are down by 75%. The country is suffering from a wave of depression. Just look at people's faces out there. No one's smiling anymore. Look at what's happening to debt. Look at the sheer number of people who will be unemployed very, very shortly. And that's why I've reached the conclusion that whilst we do have to be sensible, hand washing, hygiene, I get all of these things, but we really are at a point now, I'm utterly convinced, where the cure is worse than the disease. And it's apparent the government have learned absolutely nothing after 8 months of total incompetence.
It's true. Nigel, thank you very much indeed. Nigel Farage, leader of the Brexit Party, of course. We are live streaming right now on YouTube, on Facebook and on Twitter. What do you make of what Nigel has to say? Why does Boris Johnson have to self-isolate for 14 days? Isn't that a bad example to the rest of us? Surely he should get a test. Surely he should be able to then return to work, having tested negative 5 days after the supposed encounter with somebody who later on tested positive for COVID-19. This doesn't show that the track and testing and tracing system works. It shows that it's incompetent, doesn't it? This is Talk Radio.